Okay, so we're going to be taking our mockup that we created earlier, and we're going to be building out the complete HTML and CSS. So you'll remember that we did several variations in our previous design examples here, just to kind of illustrate a few different ways you can design your mockups. The one I'm going to be doing in completion is this kind of second one right here, or maybe this third one. So I'll show you when we get to the very end, after we do all of this, a few simple tweaks you can make to build these other mockups as well. But I'll sort of be focusing on this design right here. We're going to start out here doing our CSS wireframe. We will be making this fully responsive, so we're going to be doing our mobile wireframe as well. And it's going to be built using the CSS grid and using CSS Flexbox. So we're going to be using some modern CSS technologies. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, I'll be referencing this mockup several times as we get going here. But the first step we need to do is jump over here to your code editor program. I'm using Visual Studio Code. You can use whatever code editor you want. And I've just got here, you can see a simple index.html file that is empty, and a simple CSS file called style.css that is also empty. And these are going to be the two files we'll be working with. So we're going to start over here in our index.html, and we're just going to build out some boilerplate code. So in VS Code, if you just type doc and hit tab, it will pre-fill all of this content here for you. So then you can go ahead and just get started. Now we're going to start out here in the HTML and build all of the boilerplate code for our mockup. So let's jump back here to our mockup in Adobe XD, and let's just look at our wireframe here. Now, of course, yours will be based on however you designed your wireframe, but you can see the wireframe already shows the main sections here. So you can see from this wireframe that essentially, up here, this is my header area, and I'm going to call this my featured area. Then maybe this is my, call to action or something. This is going to be my profile area over here. You can't really see that. And this is the main content area. And then down here, I have a footer. So one thing to note is that my header, so this div 1, 2, and 3, they are 100% wide, meaning they span the entire width of the browser, where this middle section here, right, this is a fixed width. So that's not going to expand as the browser resizes. So we need to take that into account when we're building this. So those are the main areas. Let's go ahead and now flesh those up in our HTML. So I have my header, and then I'll call this maybe my featured content. So we'll come over here and let's go ahead and clear that out. And we're just going to do these with some simple div tags. Now you could use also the HTML5 header tags and a few other tags. But for right now, for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to be using div tags. So let's say div ID equals, and this first one is going to be our header. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. We're actually going to create a wrapper tag. So this one's going to be called the site wrap. So we're going to have one tag that sort of surrounds the entire website. And that's going to be called our site wrap tab. Okay, then next we're going to have one, we'll say div, and I'll say class equals header. So this is going to be our header tag, and I'm just going to write in some blank words here for now, just to kind of show you the placeholder values there. And then we're going to have another div, and it's going to have a class. We'll call this the featured header. And you can name these whatever you want. I'm just kind of making up these names here as I go here. I'm basing this, I've of course already done this ahead of time, and I'm using some notes over here to my left. And then I'm going to, we'll call this next one div. We'll give it a class of, we'll call this one the featured main. And then we have a couple more here. So then we have div class equals, we'll call this the featured profile. So this is that profile picture that we had in our mockup. And then we have here our div class equals content. So this is going to be the main content area of the website. Forgot to be filling these in. We'll just call this profile. We'll call this one main and header. Something like that. Okay, and then we have one more. So this one is going to be our last element, which is our footer. And we'll just call this guy footer. Okay, now I'm going to save, and we will refresh the browser over here, and you'll be able to see all those elements appear. So we have the header, and whoops, this one is the featured header. There we go. And you can see all those little elements right there. So this is pretty much all we need right now for our main boilerplate. We're going to be starting to do the rest in CSS, and as we kind of flesh out those main content boxes, we'll come in here and replace all these placeholder words with actual content in our menu and a few things like that. But this will get us started for right now. So now we're going to jump over to our CSS sheet. So we'll go over to our style.css, and we're going to do what I call creating a CSS wireframe. I think this is a really important step when you're learning web design, is to first basically replicate what we have over in Adobe XD. So we're going to be creating bright colored boxes exactly like this before we move over here to the mockup version. So this is what I call the CSS wireframe. So let's go ahead and get started with that. So in our CSS sheet, there's a few things we want to do here. And the first thing is we're just going to add a div for that site wrap, or a rule rather. So we're going to be targeting that site wrap. Remember, this one is the ID. That's why I'm using the pound sign, because I gave that one an ID of site wrap. The rest of these I used classes for. So the pound sign is the reference for the ID. And we're going to head and give this guy a height of 100 VH. That stands for 100 viewport height. Now, in order to see this while I'm coding here, I'm just going to turn on a temporary background color. I'll be removing this in a minute, but I'm just going to set it to red here for a minute so we can kind of watch this happen in real time over here. Now, you'll notice that I've set a background color. I expect my background color to change over here, but it's still white. This is a really common error when people are starting out. You've probably already guessed the issue possibly. But the problem is I have my CSS sheet, which is an external style sheet, but I have not linked those two together. So right now my HTML is unaware of the CSS sheet. So I need to, of course, add the tag to link these things together up inside of our head. So we will add that here. So we're going to add the link, and it's going to be rel equals style sheet. Style, make sure I spell that right. Style sheet, and the type is going to be set to text/CSS, and then the href, of course, is the location, and mine is just the style.css, like so. And this is a self-closing tag, so I still close mine like this with the / like you used to do in XHTML. In HTML5, you actually don't need to. You can just leave that off, but I'll leave mine in there. Now notice as soon as I saved, sure enough, my background turned red, and now I know I'm properly linked up. Now, I always recommend you do just a quick little check like that. You don't want to sit here and build out a ton of CSS wondering why nothing's changing. So, right, make sure your CSS sheet's linked up properly before you continue on. So this 100 viewport height, the VH, means that my site wrap element is going to take up 100% of the height. That's why it stretches clear down to the bottom, all the way down to there. Now you will notice that there is a little white border around the edge over here inside of my browser. And that's kind of by default. All browsers have a default margin set on the body tag. So we want to override that. So let's come up here and do a new rule. Now we're going to do this one for the body tag. And we are going to set margin to 0. And then save and refresh. And you can see now that goes full screen. As we expect, that default margin is gone as well. So we're going to set margin to 0. We're going to set the default padding to 0. And we're going to go ahead and set a default font family. So we're going to set the font family. Again, this is going to be whatever font family you want. I'm just going to use the default Arial Helvetica set here. And that changes, of course, the font. You can see just changed for all those little words. So that looks pretty good. And why don't we also, while we're here, change the default line height. So 1.5 EMs. So they're spaced out a little bit more when we have paragraphs that are running up. Adds for a little bit better readability. Okay, so we have our site wrap element. Now let's continue to work on our site wrap. So if we can jump back here to our mockup. So the site wrap essentially is going to be covering the entire site. So it's a div, if you will, right? It covers everything. So everything inside here is inside of our site wrap. So the site wrap is going to be our master container, and it's going to be set to be using CSS grid. What that means is every child element of that master container, so this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, and this one, are going to be what are known as CSS grid items. Okay, so that's important to remember that that master site wrap is our grid container. So with that, we need to set up the CSS grid. So we'll jump back here to our code, and we're going to add the display of grid. So that's really all you need to do. This now makes that guy a grid element. Now notice as soon as I save, all these guys are spaced out automatically into rows, and that's because the grid has the automatic rows configured. So now we're going to be using some of these grid properties. Now, we're just going to be using the CSS grid here. I'm not going to be doing a lot of teaching about the CSS grid. I have a full entire hour just dedicated, a video dedicated to CSS grid, which is an excellent video. I highly recommend you maybe watch that one before you watch this if you want to really learn the ins and outs of the CSS grid. So the property we're going to be working with first is called the grid template columns, okay? Because we want to set up our columns. So I'm going to declare it here. And then what I'm going to do is just declare this. I'm going to do this on multiple lines, just so it's a little bit easier for you to see. So I'm going to declare one FR, one FR, one FR, one FR, one FR. Let's count those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, one FR. Okay, and then I'm going to save. Now you can see what happened here is this shifted these guys. Instead of being displayed in rows by default, they now shifted over to be displayed in columns. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns. Now there's a couple things we need to learn here. The fraction unit, FR, is new, and that basically means take up all the available space. In other words, because I have 6 equal fractions, it's just going to divide my page into 6 equal width columns. Now in our mockup here, this is kind of an important consideration. So you'll remember if you've been watching this series a few videos back when we made the determinations to go with the CSS grid in this specific layout, we talked about using columns. We have a 4-column layout essentially. So we have one column here. Actually, I'm going to do this on this other mockup. It's a little bit easier to see on this one. You can really see the columns easier. So here is one column. Okay, there's 1. Here's the second one, 2, and then we have 3, and then we have 4. Okay, those are our 4 main columns. And of course, this area right here, for example, spans 3 full columns, okay? And this area, of course, spans all of those columns, etc., etc. But we have basically 4 main columns, and we can mix and match those however we want. But the thing to note is while we have 4 columns in our content area, this area right here and this area right here is that stretchy area, okay? So really, we have 6 columns. So if we kind of draw this out, and we draw a line right down here on the edge of our mockup here, and we draw a line right down here on the edge of our mockup, this is really what we're looking at. Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I drew that wrong. There's the 6th one goes out there, of course. So we have those 6 columns. And this outer edge can stretch this way, and this outer edge can stretch that way. So the outer 2 columns, number 1 and number 6, are variable width, where those 4 columns in the middle are set to a variable size. So that is why, now let's get a little bit messy here, but that is why in our HTML, we have 6 columns here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So our entire site is going to be based on this 6-column element. Now to make it easier for you to see the columns temporarily, I'm just going to do a temporary rule here. So I'm going to say site wrap sub div. So this is basically going to make all these divs appear a little bit better. So we're going to give these guys, I don't know, a background color of blue just for a minute here. And now they're all crammed together. You can't really see the distance. So there's a property in here called grid gap. And this determines, it's kind of like the margin between the grid items. It's actually more in the old school tables. It's kind of like cell spacing. Grid gap of 5 pixels. And now you can see they all have a 5 pixel gap between them. So now you can really see those 6 columns. Remember, this one will be a variable width. This one over here will be a variable width, where these ones in the middle stay the same. So now that we kind of understand that a little bit, what we can do is I'm going to rewrite this a little bit. So what you can do is I like to write these when I'm doing tutorials anyway, because it's a little easier to read, all on their own lines like this. Okay. So the first one is going to be a 1 fraction unit, meaning just take up whatever space is available. The last one is going to be a 1 fraction unit. So these middle 4 are all going to be the same. And what you need to determine here is basically what size this is, right? So you'll come to your mockup. You'll take, for example, over here, let's just look at this element. So this is the width of all 4 combined. You can see that my width is 1088. So what you can do is 1088 divided by 4. Whoops, if I can type that right, 1088 divided by 4. So each of my columns needs to be 272 pixels wide, okay, of those 4 in the middle. So what I can do then, instead of saying 1 fraction on these guys, I can say 272 pixels. Okay, and I'm going to copy this and paste that for the middle 4 and then save. And now you can see what's happening here. Now I'm going to zoom out a little bit in my preview here because I'm fairly zoomed in, but you can see the idea, right? This one stretches, and those middle 4 are always the same. So that's kind of the idea here. Now what this allows for is, I'm going to go into the responsive design mode here, is I can then pull these guys and you can kind of simulate what's going to happen, right? So those outer 2 columns will stretch and the middle 4 stay in the middle. So that's kind of how we're using that. Okay. Now I'm going to zoom back in here just a couple of clicks. Now, oftentimes when you're repeating the same value over and over and over, there is a grid property that deals with that. And it is called the repeat command. So if I'm doing the same thing, I can do something like this. So I'm going to say repeat 4 times, comma, the following. So I'm going to do a min max, and I'm going to say 0 to 72 pixels. Okay, and what this basically says is each column can be a minimum of 0 pixels up to a maximum of 272 pixels. And now when I save, nothing should change there, but that's just a little more succinct way of writing the same thing. Okay, so that deals with our columns. Next we need to do is deal with our rows. So let's jump back here to our mockup and let's take a look at the rows. Now in our specific mockup, we have, let's turn back on here. So we have a row right there. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Looks like we have 5 total rows in this specific mockup. So I'm going to go over and now set that up in the grid template. So let's come back here and we're going to set up a new property. And this one's going to be the grid template rows. Okay, so for the rows, it's basically the same thing as the columns. So there's going to be 6. I can't even remember already. We'll go back and measure them here in a second. So for right now, let's just set each one to 100 pixels. So we'll say 100 pixels, 100 pixels, 100 pixels, 100 pixels. I think we had 5. 100 pixels, 100 pixels. Okay, so we'll save. And let's see if that is how many we wanted. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's jump back to our mockup. We had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Correct. Okay, so we have 5 rows. So that's looking fine. So back here in XD, now of course this is going to be different for every single person, but I'm just going to use this little wireframe here. So you can just click on an element and you can simply get the width and height over here. So this one has a height of 104. This one has a height of 215. This one's 373, etc., right? You can just take a look at your width and height values. So we'll start off here with the top one. So it's going to be 104 pixels. Okay, so this one's going to be 104 pixels. My next one is going to be 215 pixels. So 215. My third one is going to be 373. My next one is going to be 373 as well. 373. And my last one, you have to kind of determine here, my footer area, I actually want to fill up the available space. So I'm going to set that one to 1 fraction. So my footer will just expand according to whatever is needed. Okay. Now I do have hard-coded values here for the heights of these columns, right? This one and this one, or those rows rather. But in the end, I'm going to be swapping those out to deal with the content because this paragraph might be shorter or longer and right, I might have more or less content in there. So I don't want to explicitly set the height. I'm going to let the height on these 2 columns be determined by how much HTML content is inside of those divs. So eventually we're going to swap that out here as well. But for our wireframe, it will serve its purpose fine. Okay, now you'll notice that even though we set up these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows, I'm actually not seeing any rows here in my mockup. And that's because right now my template doesn't need them. The way that the CSS grid works is it lays out your columns in a horizontal manner. So I only have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 divs. So they're only fitting in 1 row because I have 6 columns. I won't see those extra rows until I set up my grid template areas, which is what we're going to do next. So in order to set up the grid template areas, we need to individually set up a specific rule for each of my main areas of my website. So basically, every one of these main little wrappers, we're going to set up a CSS rule for. So we can go ahead and delete now this little temporary rule because we're going to be adding individual background colors here. So we'll just start out here with the header. So we'll open up our header rule here and we're going to say background color green. I'm just going to start assigning sort of random values here. So there's my header. Probably makes better sense to actually assign these things the same colors you have over here in your mockup. That way you don't get yourself too confused, but I'll just do random ones for right now. So we have the header, and so I'm going to save that, and you can see that turns green. And then I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to paste it 1, 2, 3. Whoops, actually before I paste that, sorry, getting a little ahead of myself, I need to add in the grid template area. So I'm going to give this guy a grid area, and this is a named area, and I'm just going to call it header. So I'm just going to use my same class name as my grid area name. You can name your grid areas whatever you want. But now that I have that in there, let's go ahead and paste this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we'll just rename all these. So this one right here is going to be my featured header, and we'll make this one, I don't know, purple or something. This one over here, we're going to call our featured main. I think we called this. Yep, featured main, that's this one right here. And we'll make this one orange. And then we have our featured, that little profile picture. We called featured profile. The blue we haven't used yet. And this one is our content. We called this guy. Maybe we'll make it black. And then the footer is the last area, and we'll make it, I don't know, gray or something. So this one's the header. This one is going to be we'll just copy and paste these. Featured main, we'll call this one featured headered. Profile. Content. Footer. Okay, so that should work. Now, we can't see these guys in our layout because now we need to go set up our grid template areas. So we've defined every single one of our blocks and we've given them a grid area, but because this guy has a grid area of footer, we haven't defined that grid area yet, so that's why we can't actually see it in our mockup. So now we can come back up here to our master wrapper, and we'll define this grid area. So this one's called the grid template areas. And this one is kind of a fancy property. So the reason why we're using this grid template areas, we don't have to use grid template names or grid template areas, but I think they make it fairly easy, and it's a nice visual way for people learning the CSS grid to work. So the way the grid template areas works is it's kind of confusing when you start out, but the rules here basically are a representation of your visual layout. This will make more sense here. So for example, inside of our XD template, our main header, where we're calling the main header area, it spans 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns. In other words, it spans all of the columns, okay? So the way you would write that out then in here is you imagine that the first line here is each of your columns. So I would say header space, header space, header space, header space, header, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 space, header, okay? And then save. And now you can see that that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, meaning now my header is spanning 6 of those columns, okay? And then we're just gonna go ahead and hit return here, and then we do our next row. So let's jump over here to XD. This featured content area is the same way, right? It spans all 6 of those columns. So I'm gonna copy this right here, and this will go inside quotes. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We'll save that. And you can see now my featured header spans 6 columns. And you just kind of rinse and repeat. I'm going to shrink this down quite a bit here and then pull this over so we can see this. And that'll be a little bit easier to see. There we go. And we just continue. So the next row here is, or the next area is this one. And you can see the first one is going to be blank because it doesn't, right? It's not a fluid right there. So this one's blank. And then it's 1, 2, 3. And then blank, blank. Okay, so we can come over here and set this guy up. So for our third row, that first column is blank. To do a blank, you say a period. And then it's going to be this element right here, which is our featured main. So I'll come down here and copy this. So our featured main is going to span 1, 2, 3 columns, right? So if you remember that there's one, it's easier to see over here. 1, 2, 3. Okay, and then after that, our featured profile is in that 4th column, right? That's that div right there. So that's the featured profile in the 4th. And then the 6th, or that's the 5th, sorry, the 5th. And then the 6th is blank. So then another period on the end. Okay, and we'll save and refresh. And you can see how that lays out, right? Blank, that one spans the 3 columns. That's the 4th. I keep saying 3, meaning 4 in the middle. So it's really 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6 is blank. Yeah, I said 2, 3, 4, 5. 2, 3, 4, then 5 is the featured. You get the idea. All right, next, let's go down to our next row. So let's jump over to XD. So our next row is this guy. So it's going to be blank, and then it's going to span 2 through 5, and then 6 is going to be blank. So same thing, we'll say, whoops, get my cursor in there. Blank on the first one, and then the content is going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then blank on the end. And then we'll save that. That looks great. And then our last row is our footer. So it's going to span the entire area. So I'll come down here and copy the footer word. And we will go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, because the footer spans, again, the entire width. Notice how now my footer is also going all the way to the bottom of the screen, and that's because that last row is set to 1 fraction. So it's going to take up all the available space, which is really cool. And that's how we're going to be doing our layout. So you can see just in, I mean, that's actually not a lot of lines of code. I don't have my line numbers turned on here. But in not too much CSS, we essentially have most of our CSS mockup, or our wireframe. Pull this back open. You can kind of see how that behaves there in place. So you just want to make sure that everything is matched up to your mockup. So your mockup right inside of here should be all replicated now inside of your design right here. Now that grid gap property that we set up earlier was just to kind of help us see those columns and rows. I'm now going to set that back to 0 pixels because I want those columns and rows to butt right up against each other. I can space things out with margins and padding when I start adding content later. Okay, so that is essentially how you do your CSS wireframe and mockup from your XD template. All right, now that we have our desktop CSS wireframe essentially all done, we're going to move and do our mobile CSS wireframe. Now, the great thing about CSS Grid is it makes it so easy to do responsive web design for your mobile wireframes. So what we're going to do is we're going to come over here and create a CSS media query. So we're going to use the ampersand, and then we're going to say media, and then we're going to set this guy to a we're going to say and we're going to set it to a max width. So we'll say max dash width. And again, this is kind of up to you. I'm just going to use 480 pixels, which is a semi-common value for phone size, so mobile phone size. So that's going to be the constraint. And then let's just go ahead and change one thing to make sure this is working. So we'll change our header, and let's just override the background color to yellow. Okay. So at a maximum width of 480, this should be our CSS. So let's go ahead and see. Actually, it looks like I have maybe a syntax error here. And it looks like I'm missing the screen. You have to declare what type of media. So at media screen and max width 480. Let's save that. There we go. Now we got our yellow on there. So now I can come in here and resize this guy. I'm going to pull this up and resize here. And you can see when I get above that threshold, we go yellow to green, yellow to green. So I know my media query is working. You always want to test that again before you start writing a bunch of code. So now that I know that my media query is working, I'm going to delete that little rule. And all we have to do is basically override this grid template areas property. So I'm going to copy this. In fact, I'm just going to copy this whole entire rule, and then we'll just delete the stuff we don't need. So let's paste that rule down into here. And we will delete essentially everything but that grid template areas. And that's basically all we need to do. So all we need to do is come over here and check, and you can see on our mobile design, really every column is 100% wide. That's all we're going to change. So I'm going to come in here and we're going to add that in. Now you of course can make some determinations. You can see here that I've decided in my mobile version to completely eliminate this div right here, which is my profile. So it's not even going to appear here. So I'm still going to have the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 main rows. I'm going to eliminate that one. Okay. So what we can do is just make sure our header is already going all the way. Our featured area is, so this one right here, our featured main is just going to go all the way. And instead of having the profile there, we'll just have featured main 2 times. Our content is going to go all the way as well. And the footer already goes all the way, and then we'll save that. So let's see, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that should do it. Okay, so let's test this out over here now. So jump back over here and let's do some resizing. So there's our desktop view, right? How that's working. When we get below, you can watch this number right here. When we get below 480 is when we should see that breakpoint happen. So right about there we go. So we snap at that point, and it looks like we have one issue here. This is the, oh yeah, the profile is still showing up down there. So we need to now do one more rule. So we're going to say for the profile, featured profile, we're just going to say display none. So we're going to just basically turn that div off. There we go. And now we have that all stacked up on our mobile design. And there's desktop, and then boom, there's our mobile. So that's why the CSS grid is really nice for responsive web design, because it makes building a responsive website pretty easy. You can rearrange those divs in any order you want right in the single property, and you're done. So that's pretty much it. So there's our mobile wireframe. There is our desktop CSS wireframe. They match up well here to our mockups that we designed earlier. And we've now taken that website CSS mockup or CSS wireframe to completion. So that's going to finish out this video. In the next video, we're going to be working on the actual content. So we'll go ahead and remove all those little background colors, and we'll start swapping it out for actual content, paragraphs, images, menus, links, hover states, all of that goodies. We'll build all of this menu from scratch in CSS purely, and we're going to be using the CSS Flexbox to help us arrange things in the next tutorial. So join us for part 2. Thumbs up, subscribe, like, and we will see you in the next one.